There are a number of AMD sockets that you need to be familiar with on the exam, and so I'm just going to go through them kind of briefly here, and you just need to remember certain aspects of these. The names of each one, pin counts, and those sorts of things. Just be familiar with this list as you go into the exam, and it wouldn't hurt you one bit to go out and read just a little bit about each one of these. Just go Google the name of the socket and go read about it just a little bit. First up, the AMD Socket 940. This is a 940 pin socket. It accepts 64-bit AMD server processors. It's completely square in shape. And one thing, recognizing AMD sockets is much easier than Intel because they usually stamp the names on them right here, and you can see it on the housing. This accepts the Opteron and Athlon 64 FX processors. Then you have the AM2, and the AM2 was originally named the M2. It is also 940 pins, but it's not compatible with all 940 pin AMD processors. Now, in the processor world, there's lots of confusion about what goes with what, and you'll have to reference documentation when you're trying to upgrade or change processors. Now, the AM2 supports the Athlon 64, the Opterons, and the Sempron processors, but again, well, and also the Phenom, but also make sure you check documentation. So as you go into the A+ exam, just go through this a few times, read about each one of these sockets. You don't have to really know what goes with what, but just be familiar because you could see these questions on the exam. Now, the AM2 Plus replaced the AM2. It also has 940 pins, and it works with AM2 CPUs and motherboards. Now, this gave you improved power savings over the regular AM2, and it improved the hyper transport functionality that AMD uses. Now, the AM3 replaced the AM2 Plus. You can kind of see how we're progressing. This one had 941 pins, and this was designed specifically for the Phenom 2 processors. This provided support for DDR3 SDRAM, so much faster RAM there before I go to the next one. And this was probably a significant one that you'll most likely see on the exam because of that DDR3 SDRAM support. Then the AM3 Plus is a modification of the AM3, 942 pins, one more than the AM3. It's compatible with the AM3 processors, and it offered a number of performance, power, and cooling improvements over the AM3. Now, the socket FM1 was designed for AMD's desktop and notebook platforms. It accepts the Llano A series APUs, the accelerated processing units. Notice we got a new term here as a option or as an alternative to the old CPU or central processing unit. Notice it's an accelerated processing unit. It's quad core, meaning it's working as 4 CPUs. It integrates graphics functionalities onto the processor. That's kind of new and interesting and different. And then the last one is the Socket F. Now, this is one of the very few AMD LGA or land grid array sockets. This could make this a prime target for a question on the exam, so just make sure you remember that the Socket F is one of the few AMD LGA sockets. It has 1,207 pins. And another thing I might warn you about or kind of tip you off to, a lot of times the land grid array or the LGA sockets are used for high numbers of pins because the old pins protruding up from the motherboard, they had trouble after a while of manufacturing so many of those, and so they changed them. Now, this is used primarily, the Socket F is, in AMD's server line of products. And this is the base for the AMD Quad FX platform. Now, that's a lot of really kind of interesting nerd type information. Just know the basics on these things. Be familiar with the AMD sockets that are mentioned here because these are directly mentioned in CompTIA's exam objectives. And then just kind of know the pin numbers, what processors go in them. And if I were you, I'd create me a little chart, memorize that, then reproduce it on your notes before you start your A+ exam once you're in the examination room. So that's a quick look at the AMD sockets that you need to be familiar with.